Good morning. Welcome to stemCONNECT Earth Day. My name is Chelsea, and I'm going to be here today with William Beckerson, and he is going to, or I should say Dr. William Beckerson, and he is going to talk to you guys about some zombie ants. So I just definitely want to make sure that you guys enjoy the session. We keep it super engaging. So please feel free to send in any questions that you guys have using your question function, and we will read those off during the Q&A towards the end. If you guys are having any difficulty with any audio or webcam, please also send me a quick little note on questions, and I will definitely help you guys out. Other than that, we will kick it over to you, William, and you guys have a good session.
Thank you. Happy Earth Day, everybody. Today I'm really excited to talk to you about this very fascinating topic that's pretty pertinent to Florida because these little zombie ants are all over the place. And in fact, if you've ever gone to like a local park, chances are you've walked by one and not noticed. But before we begin talking about these really cool specimens, I want to briefly introduce to you what I mean when we talk about a zombie, right? Because, you know, especially around Halloween time, people start to get into these movies that are all about these zombies that are really fun, but maybe not so biologically relevant. So things like The Land of the Dead or Zombieland, where the dead are kind of coming back to life, right, and walking around, and that's what we refer to as zombies. That's really fun, but in terms of biology, it doesn't make a lot of sense, right? When something dies, it starts to deteriorate, the muscles break down. So the concept of them being able to kind of crawl out of their graves is a little bit far placed in fantasy. But there are kind of this subcategory of zombie movies that are based more on this idea of a pathogen, like a virus or a bacteria, that get into people and then cause them to behave in these very zombie-like ways. And these movies are much more biologically interesting, right? Still very, very fiction, right? These aren't real case scenarios, but at least in the case of how organisms interact with one another, these make plausible sense. So when we talk about how organisms interact with one another, there are kind of three flavors in which they do this. The first is called mutualism, right? And this is when two organisms interact with each other and both benefit from that interaction. So pollinators like bees, which are very important to our agriculture and also the environment, and one of the species that are really threatened by global climate change. They interact with flowers by basically landing on the anthers of the flower, and they get some nectar, and they use that to make honey and to get food for themselves. And in return, the plant deposits some of its pollen on the very hairy bees, and they fly to other plants and help them populate, help them basically spread their pollen to other plants. So in this case, the plant is getting a benefit for reproduction, and the insect is getting some food out of it, so both benefit. The second type is commensalism. Commensalism is where one species benefits, but the other is not really hurt, nor are they really getting any benefit out of it. So tree frogs are a great example of this. So tree frogs have evolved to kind of blend into the trees they like to hide in. So this gives them camouflage. So being up in the trees keeps them safe away from predators. However, the tree doesn't really get any benefit out of this, nor is it really impacted because, frogs are pretty light. They're not hurting the tree. So they're kind of just hanging out there, and the tree's doing its own thing. And the third category, which is a category that I'm particularly interested in when we study these kind of zombie ants, is parasitism. So parasitism is when one species benefits at the cost or a negative effect of another individual. So think of if you've ever been camping, right, and you get a tick, or if you've ever been bitten by a mosquito. These are examples of parasites because the parasite gets what's called a blood meal, right? They suck your blood, and that's what they eat. And basically the other species in that interaction, you might get like an itchy welt, or maybe you might get some, like malaria or other types of, pathogens that are basically deposited during that biting process. But even at the fundamental level, that insect biting you takes some of your energy, takes some of your blood. So that would be an example of parasitism. Now, in particular, I study fungal parasites. So fungi also do lots of these symbioses as well. So there's mutualistic fungi, such as mycorrhizal fungi, and these are just fungus that grow in the ground and around root systems. So you can see in this picture here, the one on the left, this is a patch of grass with a mycorrhizal fungal system. And basically you can see that it's very lush and green. And the one on the right is grown in an environment without mycorrhizal fungi. And you can see that it's a lot more spread out and sparse, and it's not as lush. And the reason for this is because having mycorrhizal fungi helps irrigate the soil, meaning it helps water get to the roots a lot easier than in systems that don't. So in return, these fungi actually kind of get some of the sugars that are stored in the root systems of these plants. So it's almost like a trade system. They kind of trade water for sugar. Now there's also commensal fungi. Lichens are a good example of this, although lichens aren't exactly fungi. They're kind of 2 parts fungi, 1 part photosynthetic algae, meaning algae that use light to get energy. But they like to grow on the sides of trees, right? And they grow on the woody part, so it's not really hurting the tree. They don't eat the tree. They're just kind of sitting on them like the tree frogs do. And this helps the lichen get up in the air to, basically get more sunlight. So the lichen benefits, but the tree isn't really harmed in the process. And then there are great examples of fungal pathogens as well. Lots of plant pathogens that cause damage agriculturally. There's what are called necrotrophs, which are just basically fungi that just eat the plant. And then there are things called biotrophs, which are a little bit more relevant to the zombie fungi that we're going to talk about here shortly, that like to live on or in living hosts. So they kind of feed off of a host without killing them. Now there's other examples of fungal pathogens for animals too. They're not just associated with plants. So if you've ever had athlete's foot, right? If you wear your socks too long without changing them, or you play a lot of sports and it gets really like wet in your socks, you could get athlete's foot, which is a type of yeast. Same thing with oral thrush. People who have weak immune systems sometimes get fungus that grow in their mouth like this. And then there are types of fungi that basically are just pathogens of animals. So chytrids are types of fungi that like to infect amphibians. Now, regardless of what type of fungi you're looking at, they all kind of interact in the same way. There's 2 major parts. There's what's called the fruiting body, or the mushroom, right? So this is the part we're most familiar with. When you're ordering a mushroom pizza, you're actually eating the fruiting body of the mushroom. And then the much larger portion is called the mycelium, right? And if you think back to what we were talking about with the mycorrhizal fungi that grow underground, that's what's going on there. It's got a really large mycelium. And you can think of this as like a big spider web under the ground. Now, fungi interact with their environment through secretion of chemicals, right? So when we talk about how fungi eat their food, rather than putting food inside their mouth and then digesting it like we do, they simply secrete their saliva outside of the hyphae, the mycelium, and then those enzymes break down the material and they absorb in the chemicals. So we call fungi chemotrophs, which means chemo, chemical, and troph, which refers to how they get their food. So it's a trophic system. It's a fancy science word for how they eat. So if you think of bread mold, or if you've ever had like a piece of cheese that got moldy, right? Basically, the mold is the fruiting body of that fungus, and underneath it, it's secreting chemicals to break down the cheese or the bread, and then it absorbs that nutrients. Now, when we talk about zombie fungi, the same thing's going on here. So zombie fungi have these fruiting bodies that come out of the ant, but they also have these mycelium networks inside the body of the ant. And these mycelium are going to secrete chemicals that do some rather interesting things that we'll talk about in a moment. So to introduce to you the system of zombie ants, I have kind of a spooky video for you that will play from National Geographic's.
Fungi and slime molds race to decompose dead matter on the forest floor. Many spread by releasing spores, up to 30,000 a second. If just one of these spores lands in the right place and takes root, it can colonize a whole new area. But not all fungi feed on the dead. Days ago, a spore landed on this ant. Now she's acting strange. A network of roots has infiltrated her muscles. Her body has been taken over by cordyceps, a parasitic fungus. It floods her brain with chemicals, drugging her, compelling her to head where conditions are perfect. Just the right amount of light, just the right amount of humidity for the parasite growing inside. It forces her to clamp down in a death bite, and cordyceps reveals its gruesome nature. After 3 weeks of growth, cordyceps can release its own spores, infecting more ants, releasing more spores, infecting more ants, releasing more spores, infecting more ants, infecting more ants, more and more and more ants. Cordyceps can wipe out entire ant colonies. But more than just ants are at risk. There are over 600 species of cordyceps spread across the world. Most are found in jungles, where they prey on a whole host of victims.
So yeah, basically this is the way that Ophiocordyceps infects ants. So what we just watched was a great example of its life cycle. So I'm just going to briefly go over that a little bit more in detail. So Ophiocordyceps is what we call an ascomycete. It's a sac fungi. And we call it this because it houses its spores in these little sac structures. So if you look at this, this is a cross section of the fruiting body of the Ophiocordyceps. And you'll see that there's these little pouches that have these really wispy-like spores in there. And the fruiting body actually works like a harpoon system, right? It fires these spores out and they float into the wind, and they either land on the ground where they'll remain for a very long time, or they'll land on insects. And either way, the insect eventually comes into contact with the spore and becomes infected. So once the insect is infected, the spores grow inside the ant and start to secrete chemicals, right? That rather than just eat the ant, also cause behavioral changes. And one of these is zombie-like behaviors like walking and asocial behavior, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a few slides later. But the most important behavioral change that it causes is it causes the insects to climb. And this is a really well-known phenomena called summiting behavior. Summiting just, like climbing a mountain, right? So basically they climb high up into trees. And this is good because if they were to just die on the ground and the mushroom would grow out of their head on the ground, they wouldn't be able to spread their spores very far. So by manipulating the host to climb trees, they're increasing how far they can spread their spores. Once the conditions are right, they'll then cause the ant to do what's called the death grip, where they'll bite down onto whatever substrate they're sitting on. And this holds the ant there in case like a strong wind comes by, or if another insect were to bump into it, it's not going to knock it out of the tree. So these are two very important behavioral changes that are caused by the fungus. But we're interested in, how do these fungi exactly manipulate their hosts, and how did they evolve to, do these really interesting, intricate things? So to kind of explain how that could have happened, we need to talk a little bit about evolution. So when you think about evolution, there's two major components. There's genetic mutation and selection. So let's take an example of moths, for example. Perhaps we have a population of moths that are these kind of white-colored moths, and then you have what's called a genetic mutation in that color gene that then leads to these kind of brown, woody-colored moths to be born, right? So when we think about the term mutation, we're thinking about a change in a gene. Now, over time, those woody colored moths are actually going to have an advantage because they blend into the trees much better than these white moths do. And this is where selection comes into play. So predators come in and they can very easily find the white moths, so they begin to eat all the white moths. But the kind of brown colored moths have an advantage and can hide, so they're the ones that live on and make more moths. So what you'll see is over time, that population of moths will become more predominantly this brown color. And this is basically what's happening when we talk about zombie ants as well, except zombie ants kind of evolve along with their hosts. So we call this coevolution, right? So coevolution is when different species evolve together and they actually act as the selective pressure for one another. So let me give you another example. So let's take the crab that eats this snail, okay? Crabs are going to eat this snail and in doing so create a selective pressure for tougher snail shells. So as they eat the soft shell snails, the thicker ones will live and they'll survive and they'll reproduce, and so the population will have thicker shells. Now, as this happens, we have kind of a pendulum effect where it's going to then become a selective pressure on the crabs, because as crabs eat all the soft shell snails and then they have trouble breaking into the hard shells, it's going to create a selective pressure where only the crabs born that have like really strong claws will be able to eat. So then the strong clawed crabs will continue to grow and they'll make more strong clawed crabs. So over time, you have this back and forth where the claws are going to become bigger and the shells are going to become tougher, and then that makes the claws become bigger again, and then that makes the shells become bigger again. And this is a type of coevolution that we call the Red Queen effect. And this is actually a term from Through the Looking Glass, or you may be more familiar with the Disney version, Alice in Wonderland. There's a phrase in the book where the Red Queen says it takes all the running you can do just to stay in the same place, which is kind of a nonsense term, but it makes a lot of sense when we talk about coevolution, because these two species are constantly evolving, trying to, adapt to one another, but the end result is the same, right? They're basically just stuck in that same situation where you have the predator trying to eat the prey. So when we talk about coevolution from microbes or microorganisms like the zombie fungus, this is an intense relationship, because the host is not only a selective pressure on the microbe, but it's also their environment, right? So it's kind of like a double whammy. So when changes happen in populations of their host, those changes are going to cause changes to the fungus in this case as well. And this is exactly what we see with Ophiocordyceps. So each species of ant kind of has one species of Ophiocordyceps that infects it. And basically you can surmise that this has evolved through coevolution, where changes to the host or changes in the ants lead to changes in the fungi. And over time, you wind up with this kind of one-for-one system. Now, we think that this happens because the chemicals that are secreted that we talked about in the Ophiocordyceps become adapted specifically for that species of ant. So this is a really fancy graph that we made from our lab where we looked at those secreted chemicals and we compared them by each species. And what we found is there's these large groups of chemicals that are only secreted by those particular ants. So in this case, the Camponotus floridanus ant is infected by its own species of Ophiocordyceps. And it's likely due to the types of compounds that they make to manipulate these behaviors. Now, the way that we think it does this is by growing around the brains and secreting chemicals into the brain. So when you look at the ant tissue, we see that if you want to think of the mycelium, right, we see that growing inside the ant into the muscle tissue and eating, the fats and the muscles, but it doesn't grow into the brain or the neurological tissue, which is really interesting. Instead, it kind of grows around it. And we think that this allows them to secrete compounds directly into these nervous tissues that then cause behavioral changes in the ant. So I've got a couple examples of these behavioral changes for you. So we're gonna look at videos 2, 3, and 4. So the first video here is going to be how ants normally behave. So that'll give you kind of a baseline when we're talking about how these behaviors change when they're infected. Okay, so this first video here is just basically how ants normally walk. And what you're going to see is the ant is going to walk. And what it's doing is it's actually smelling out in front of it, because ants communicate through chemical compounds, through pheromones and on all these other types of chemicals they secrete. That's how they talk to one another. So while it's walking, it's kind of smelling for the trail that was likely left by like a scout ant that maybe found a lollipop on the ground somewhere. And then it walked back home and laid a trail so the rest of the ants can find their way over there. So that's normal ant behavior, and they're very social. They communicate with one another. So in video 2, what we're going to see is these types of really slow, careful movements in walking are going to change a little bit. So what you'll see here is an infected ant in the lab, and it's a little difficult to see, but one thing you can tell right off the bat is they're kind of just running, and they run until they bump into something, they turn, they run until they bump into something, they turn, they run, right? So it's these very like aggressive zombie-like behaviors that you might see in movies. But you'll also notice that it's not antinating anymore. They're kind of like stuck like antlers, right? And we think that the fungal tissue plays a role in preventing these from working properly. So it's not able to smell or communicate. So you'll see that it's not interested in talking to its sisters, and it just kind of runs around and bumps into things until it winds up in the proper place to climb that pencil that we have in the middle of the arena. So we call this like wobble walking or like hyperactivity. And right there, you can kind of see it's having a little bit of a twitchy fit. All right, so in this last video, I'm going to show you the most important behavioral change, which is the death grip. So you see here, this ant has bitten down onto a piece of air moss. So when you go out in Florida, like you go to your local park, this is usually where you find the ants, is kind of hanging in trees. They really like to bite onto this air moss. So what it does is that the Ophiocordyceps causes them to latch down, and you'll see in that video, if we could play it one more time, or either way, basically they bite down.
Sorry, I can do it. Yes, I'm sorry.
Either way, they bite down, but you can see that the ant isn't doing this intentionally. As a matter of fact, it's kind of freaked out about the whole thing. It's trying to run backwards. You can see it's like pulling, trying to get off of the air moss. So this isn't a behavior that the ant wants to be doing. It's a behavior that's caused by the Ophiocordyceps infection. All right, so we'll jump back to the PowerPoint here. So let's talk a little bit about Ophiocordyceps in their host range. So this right here is a map of Camponotus. It's the carpenter ant. So all of these different species of Ophiocordyceps infect carpenter ants. And you can see that carpenter ants are ubiquitous, meaning they're all over the place. Really, the only place you can't find carpenter ants is like in the Arctic, right? So they're all over the world. So plenty of opportunities for coevolution to occur, or what we would call maybe even a host shift, where you basically might jump to a new species of ant. Now, when we look at our map that's generated by a program that we use called iNaturalist, you can see in the bottom here that each one of these boxes represents an identified Ophiocordyceps. So you can see that even though ants are all over the world, the Ophiocordyceps is not found all over the world. And granted, this app is kind of newer, so this isn't a complete map, but you can notice some trends right off the bat. You'll see that in the desert of the United States, or in Northern Africa, or in the Middle East, you don't really see Ophiocordyceps. And that's because fungi in general like really warm and really damp or moist environments. So they need those two conditions in order to thrive and survive. So you can think of Ophiocordyceps as Goldilocks, right? It can't be too cold and it can't be too warm. It has to be just right. Now, this is important when we talk about the implications of carpenter ants, because to many homeowners in Florida, these carpenter ants are pests, right? They actually kind of destroy the foundation of some of these more wooden built houses. And in fact, you'll often see in nature carpenter ants and termites kind of working together, because carpenter ants, contrary to popular belief, don't actually eat the wood. They just burrow into the wood to make their homes. So here's an example of a log we found while we were searching for carpenter ants for our experiments. And you can see that they form these kind of intricate tunnels in the logs. And, to an ant, wood is wood, so they'll do the same thing to houses. So you can think of Ophiocordyceps as actually kind of being a control or a check on the ant population, because without Ophiocordyceps, there'd be more carpenter ants. And we can think of this in terms of a food chain. So a food chain is a really simplified version of what we refer to as a food web, or all the different ways in which things eat other things. And we can think of Ophiocordyceps as being kind of the thing that eats carpenter ants, or the thing that, basically kills some of their population. So what happens if we just eliminate a species from a food chain? Well, in this case, if we eliminate the mouse, the flowers or the plant vegetation that they eat will increase in population because there's no predators for them anymore. Likewise, the things that eat that mouse will decrease in population because they don't have as much food. So when you eliminate any kind of species, you cause dramatic changes to the food web or the food chains. So this is one of the reasons why researching global warming and how that impacts certain species is really, really important. And in this case, if we were to eliminate Ophiocordyceps, you could imagine that the carpenter ants would increase in populations to some degrees. And this is important because the last year, in 2020, we had in the United States the record number of hurricanes in a single year and a record number in forest fires in the same year. We also had several pretty dramatic droughts. So these are all things that basically change the conditions of certain areas. And when you think about Ophiocordyceps, right, they're the Goldilocks. They like things just perfect. So when you start to increase the annual temperature, or if you start to add a whole bunch of water, or if things become too dry, those Ophiocordyceps species, they won't grow. So we don't know what kind of impacts that this has, on that system in terms of zombie ants. And we also, you'll get tons of medicine from fungi. So if you've ever taken an antibiotic, antibiotics were first discovered in fungi, in the penicillium, which is a type of mold. So we are currently looking in these Ophiocordyceps species to see if there are types of medications that might be able to help with like behavior problems, so like depression or certain types of behavioral illnesses, because they are so unique in terms of manipulating animal behavior. So if climate change were to wipe them out, we also potentially lose a really good resource for drug manufacturing. So what we do is we go out and we find these. We go on zombie hunts. So we go, like I said, if you go to your local parks in Florida, chances are you can find some of these zombie ants, and they're usually about 2 meters in the air. So like if 6 foot, they like to hang out right at about that height. And you can find them pretty much all year round, although we do see them more often towards the drier parts of the year. So like in October, for example. So it's a really great thing to do during Halloween. And what we do is we bring these back to the lab and we do studies to find out how they manipulate their ant hosts. And one way that we do this is by using an app called iNaturalist. So you can think of iNaturalist as basically Pokemon Go, but for real life. So you can go out, you can take a picture using this app of like a frog, and the app will tell you what kind of frog that is, just like a Pokédex for all of you Pokemon fans out there. So what we like to do is we like to go out and we like to take pictures of these infected carpenter ants. So if you actually go to this app, you can Google or you can search for these Ophiocordyceps species, and it will tell you where they've been found before. So it not only works as a nice way to like catalog and to save pictures of all the cool species that you've found, whether it be like a frog or a bird or a cool flower, but it also shows you where other people have found them, so you can go and find them for yourself. Now, iNaturalist also has an app called Seek, and Seek is like a goal-oriented version of this. So where iNaturalist is like, just take a picture of whatever you want, and it will tell you what it is, and then you can save those pictures on their platform, and scientists can actually use that data for real research. Seek is like a task, so it'll be like, here are all the organisms that are near you, see if you can find them, and you go out and you take a picture, and when you find them, they give you badges, or basically these cool little rewards that said you have found 5 of the frog species, or you have found 1 of each of these flower species. So it's a really fun game to go outside and enjoy nature and to learn more about the environment around you. So with that, I'd like to promote a little bit about our zombie fungus foray, which is the project that we do to go out and find these zombie ants with the community. So we have a Twitter page at Zombie Antics, and please go on there and follow us. It's a pretty new Twitter profile that we made, but we're trying to use it, especially in Florida, to try to highlight when people in the community find these zombie ants. So you'll be able to find lots of examples of people who have found zombie ants in Florida. And then we also have a website called the zombiefungusforay.com. And you can go there and learn more about how these zombie ants work. There's tips on there about how to find them and how to be a good zombie hunter. And there's more videos on there about how these Ophiocordyceps species manipulate host behavior. And in particular, a little Easter egg for you. One way that we didn't talk about yet was they actually manipulate their wake-sleep cycle. So there's some cool videos on our website about how they do that as well. And I'm always open to talk to classrooms. If you guys have more questions, you can always email me at william.beckerson@ucf.edu. And I'd love to either Skype call with your class, or as the pandemic starts to wane, perhaps we can do some in-person zombie hunts as well. So thank you so much for your time today, and I hope you guys learned a little bit about these really cool creatures around you. And I hope that you understand the importance of studying things like climate change and why Earth Day is such an important day to recognize the impacts that we're having on our planet. So
awesome. Well, you just rounded that out absolutely perfectly. So we are out of time, but thank you guys so much for joining. We are going to jump on over to our coral restoration session. So that is the last one that we have for Earth Day. So make sure to jump that over and check that out with us. William, thank you so much. We really enjoyed learning all about that. I definitely know I learned many things today, so I appreciate that. So thank you guys so much. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we hope to see you soon.
Thank you so much.
Bye.